There are moments in life when a single decision changes everything forever, and mine came at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in March when I decided to surprise my husband with his favorite Chinese takeout from the restaurant across from his office building. I had no idea that walking into that parking garage would shatter every assumption I'd made about my marriage, my husband, and the life we'd built together over the past 7 years. The evening had started like any other Tuesday in our routine-driven life. David had called around 6 to tell me he'd be working late again, something that had become increasingly common over the past few months. He sounded tired and stressed, apologizing for missing dinner once more, promising he'd make it up to me over the weekend. I'd responded with the same understanding tone I always used, telling him not to worry, that I'd save him some leftovers, that his career was important and I supported his dedication. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly I'd been playing my role as the supportive wife, never questioning, never pushing, never demanding more than he was willing to give. I'd become an expert at accommodating his schedule, at finding ways to fill the growing number of empty evenings, at convincing myself that this phase of intense work demands would eventually pass and things would return to normal. But that Tuesday night, sitting alone in our living room with a documentary I wasn't really watching, something shifted in me. Maybe it was the way he'd sounded, almost relieved when I'd said I understood about dinner. Or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't remember the last time we'd had an uninterrupted evening together. Whatever it was, I found myself missing him with an intensity that surprised me. That's when I got the idea to surprise him with takeout from Golden Dragon, the Chinese restaurant he'd discovered near his office and couldn't stop raving about. It seemed like the perfect gesture, thoughtful, spontaneous, the kind of thing the woman he'd fallen in love with would have done without a second thought. I imagined his face lighting up when I walked into his office with the familiar red and gold containers. How grateful he'd be for the interruption. How we might even eat together in his office and talk the way we used to. I threw on jeans and a sweater, grabbed my purse, and drove the 25 minutes to his downtown office, building with a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in months. The restaurant was busy but efficient, and I ordered his usual orange chicken, vegetable fried rice, and extra egg rolls, along with something for myself. The smell of garlic and ginger filled my car as I drove the 3 blocks to his building, already imagining his surprised smile. The office building was mostly dark except for a few scattered windows, still glowing on various floors. David worked for a mid-sized accounting firm on the 12th floor, and I could see lights on up there, which confirmed that people were indeed working late. I felt vindicated in my impulse to bring him dinner, proud of myself for being thoughtful instead of resentful about his long hours. The parking garage beneath the building was dimly lit and mostly empty, which made sense for after 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I found a visitor spot near the elevator and gathered the takeout bags, checking my phone to see if I should text David to let him know I was coming up. But I decided against it. The surprise would be better if it was completely unexpected. That's when I saw it. A silver Honda Accord parked in one of the employee spots, the same model and color as the car belonging to Jessica Chin, David's colleague who I'd met at several office parties over the years. I knew it was hers because of the small dent in the rear bumper and the university parking sticker she'd never removed from her back window. My first thought wasn't suspicion, it was relief. Of course Jessica was there too. That explained why David had been working so many late nights recently. They were probably collaborating on some big project, maybe preparing for the annual audit season that always made everyone at his firm crazy. I felt foolish for all the moments. I'd wondered if he was avoiding me, if something was wrong between us that he wasn't telling me about. I walked toward the elevator with renewed confidence, excited to see both of them and maybe finally understand what had been keeping David at the office so much lately. The takeout bags rustled as I shifted them to press the elevator call button, and I realized I'd probably ordered enough food to share with Jessica too. It would be like an impromptu office picnic. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt longer than usual, but I attributed that to my anticipation. When the doors opened, I could see light coming from the direction of David's office, which was around the corner from the main reception area. I walked quietly, not wanting to startle anyone who might be deep in concentration. The hallway was carpeted, so my footsteps were silent as I approached David's office. His door was partially closed, but I could see the warm glow of his desk lamp and hear the low murmur of voices. Two voices, David's familiar baritone and Jessica's higher, softer tone. They were talking quietly and I couldn't make out the words, but something about the intimacy of their conversation made me pause. I stood in the hallway holding the takeout bags, suddenly uncertain about barging in. What if they were discussing something confidential, something I wasn't supposed to hear? What if Jessica was having some kind of personal crisis and David was counseling her? I'd always known he was a good listener, someone people naturally confided in. Maybe that's all this was. But then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Jessica's laugh. Not the polite, professional laugh I'd heard at office parties, but something softer, more intimate. The kind of laugh a woman makes when she's completely comfortable with someone, when she's not performing or being careful about boundaries. I took a step closer to the door, my heart starting to pound in a way that had nothing to do with excitement anymore. The conversation had stopped, and the silence felt charged with something I couldn't identify, but definitely recognized on some primal level. Then I heard David's voice, barely above a whisper. "You know, this is getting complicated." Jessica's response was even quieter. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about you." The takeout bags slipped from my hands and hit the carpeted floor with a soft thud. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet hallway, and I held my breath, hoping they hadn't heard. But the damage was done, not from the dropped food, but from the words I'd just overheard. I stood there frozen, my mind struggling to process what I'd heard while my body already knew the truth. The late nights, the distant behavior, the way David had seemed both guilty and relieved when I'd been understanding about his work schedule. It all suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. I heard movement from inside the office and panic shot through me. I couldn't let them find me here, couldn't face whatever scene would unfold if they discovered me eavesdropping in the hallway. I grabbed the takeout bags and hurried back toward the elevator, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the call button. The elevator ride down felt like it lasted hours. I stared at my reflection in the polished metal doors, seeing a woman I barely recognized, someone who looked shocked and lost and fundamentally changed from the person who had ridden up just minutes before. The takeout bags in my hands felt like evidence of my own naivety, proof of how completely I'd misunderstood the situation I was walking into. When I reached the parking garage, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to go back upstairs and confront them, to demand an explanation and force everything into the open. Part of me wanted to drive home and pretend I'd never come here, never heard those words, never seen Jessica's car in the parking garage. But mostly, I just sat there trying to reconcile the David I thought I knew with the man I had just overheard in that office. My husband, who had always been honest to a fault, who had never given me reason to doubt his faithfulness, who had looked me in the eye just hours earlier and explained why he'd be working late. Again, I thought about all the recent changes in our relationship that I'd attributed to work stress. The way he'd seemed distracted during our conversations, checking his phone more frequently, being less physically affectionate. The way he'd started working out more regularly and paying more attention to his appearance. The way he'd become protective of his phone, taking it with him to the bathroom and keeping it face down during dinner. Signs that seemed obvious now, but had been easy to rationalize when I trusted him completely. I'd been so focused on being supportive and understanding that I'd ignored my own instincts, dismissing the small voice in my head that had been trying to tell me something was wrong. I finally started the car and drove home, the smell of Chinese food filling the space around me like a cruel reminder of my own foolishness. The meal I'd bought to surprise my husband with my thoughtfulness was now evidence of how thoroughly he'd been deceiving me. When I got home, I put the takeout containers in the refrigerator and sat at our kitchen table, staring at my phone. David would probably be home within the hour, and I had to decide how to handle this. Did I confront him immediately? Did I wait and gather more evidence? Did I pretend nothing had happened while I figured out my next move? The rational part of my mind told me that overhearing a few sentences wasn't enough to convict him of anything. Maybe I'd misunderstood the context. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for what had sounded like an intimate conversation between my husband and his colleague. But my body knew better. The sick feeling in my stomach, the way my hands were still shaking, the sudden clarity about all the small changes I'd been ignoring, everything pointed to the same devastating conclusion. I was still sitting at the kitchen table when David came home at 11:30, looking tired but not particularly guilty. He kissed me hello the same way he always did, asked about my evening, apologized again for working so late. His performance was flawless, warm and loving, and completely convincing. If I hadn't been standing in that hallway 2 hours earlier, I would have believed every word. We went through our normal bedtime routine, David showering while I brushed my teeth, both of us changing into pajamas, him setting his alarm while I checked the locks on the front door. Everything was exactly as it always was, which somehow made it worse. How could he maintain such perfect normalcy while carrying such an enormous secret? I lay awake long after David fell asleep, listening to his breathing and trying to figure out who this man was that I'd been sharing a bed with. The David I thought I knew would never have an affair, would never lie to me so effortlessly, would never risk destroying our marriage for someone else. But the evidence suggested that either I'd never really known him at all, or he'd become someone entirely different without me noticing. The next morning brought no clarity, only more questions. David was his usual self at breakfast, checking his phone occasionally but not obsessively, talking about his day and asking about mine. When he mentioned that he'd probably be working late again that evening, I watched his face carefully for any sign of deception, but he seemed genuinely apologetic about the continued long hours. Either he was a better actor than I'd ever imagined, or I was losing my mind and had misinterpreted what I'd heard the night before. The doubt was almost worse than the certainty had been. At least when I'd been sure about what I'd overheard, I'd known where I stood. Now I was questioning my own perceptions, wondering if grief and suspicion were making me paranoid. I decided I needed more information before I could act on anything. If David was having an affair, I needed to be certain before I destroyed our marriage with accusations that might be unfounded. If he wasn't, I needed to understand why I was feeling so disconnected from him, why my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Over the next week, I became someone I didn't recognize, suspicious, sneaky, constantly analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings. I started paying attention to David's schedule more carefully, noting when he said he'd be working late and cross-referencing it with what I could observe about his actual activities. I found myself driving by his office building on nights when he claimed to be working, checking to see if his car was there, if the lights were on in his department. I felt like a detective investigating my own life, gathering evidence about the man I'd been married to for 7 years. The worst part was how normal everything seemed on the surface. David was still affectionate, still interested in my day, still making plans for the weekend and talking about our summer vacation. If he was having an affair, he was managing to compartmentalize it completely, maintaining our relationship as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, even if it was just my awareness of the possibility that our marriage wasn't what I thought it was. I found myself studying David's face when he didn't know I was watching, looking for signs of guilt or dissatisfaction or longing for someone else. I analyzed his phone behavior, his work clothes, his cologne choices, searching for clues about a secret life I might have been oblivious to. 2 weeks after the incident at his office, I decided I needed to know for certain. I couldn't continue living in this state of suspended doubt, couldn't keep pretending everything was normal while harboring such fundamental questions about my husband's faithfulness. On a Thursday evening, when David said he'd be working late, I drove to his office building again. This time, I wasn't carrying takeout and hopeful expectations. This time, I was carrying the weight of 2 weeks' worth of doubt and the determination to finally get answers. Jessica's car was in the parking garage again. David's car was there too, but that wasn't surprising since he'd told me he'd be working late. What was surprising was that when I took the elevator to the 12th floor, their offices were dark. Completely dark. No signs of anyone working late, no computers running, no desk lamps casting warm pools of light. I stood in the darkened hallway where I'd overheard their conversation 2 weeks earlier, finally accepting what I'd been trying so hard to doubt. David wasn't working late. He was somewhere else with Jessica, doing something that required them to maintain the fiction of being at the office. The evidence was circumstantial, but clear enough for me to stop questioning my own perceptions. My husband was having an affair, and he was lying to me about it with an ease that suggested this wasn't a recent development. I drove home feeling strangely calm, almost relieved to finally have certainty instead of doubt. The worst part of the past 2 weeks hadn't been suspecting David of cheating. It had been wondering if I was crazy, if my instincts were wrong, if I was destroying my own peace of mind over nothing. Now I knew I wasn't crazy. Now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. David came home around midnight, full of apologies and stories about the demanding client who'd kept everyone at the office so late. He was showered and smelled like cologne I didn't recognize, small details that might have seemed insignificant before, but now felt like confirmation of what I already knew. I listened to his explanations with the detached interest of someone watching a performance, noting how smoothly he lied, how believable his stories were, how easily he maintained eye contact while describing a version of his evening that bore no resemblance to reality. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day thinking about my options. I could confront David directly, but that would give him the opportunity to deny everything or promise to end the affair without addressing the fundamental trust issues his deception had created. I could hire a private investigator to gather irrefutable evidence, but that felt like prolonging the agony and spending money to confirm what I already knew in my heart. Or I could take control of the situation myself, force a confrontation that would bring everything into the open and require David to make a choice about what he really wanted. That evening, when David called to say he'd be working late again, I told him I'd bring dinner to the office around 9. The silence on his end of the line was telling, just a few seconds too long before he responded that he wasn't sure when he'd be free, that it might be better if I didn't come. His resistance confirmed everything. If he'd really been working, he would have welcomed the interruption and the meal. The fact that he was trying to discourage me from coming to the office told me everything I needed to know about where he actually planned to spend his evening. I told him I understood, that I'd see him when he got home, that I hoped his work went well. But this time, I wasn't being understanding to be supportive. I was being understanding to be strategic. At 9 o'clock, I drove to David's office building one more time. Both cars were in the parking garage again, but this time I didn't go up to check if they were actually in their offices. Instead, I called David's cell phone. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear Jessica's voice in the background before he quickly moved to somewhere quieter. I told him I was worried because I'd driven by the office and noticed his car in the parking garage, but couldn't see any lights on the 12th floor. I asked if everything was okay, if he was safe, if he needed me to come up and check on him. The panic in his voice was immediate and obvious. He stammered through an explanation about working in a conference room on a different floor, about how the project had moved to a different area of the building, about how everything was fine and I didn't need to worry. But I could hear Jessica's voice again in the background, and this time I could make out her words, "Is everything okay?" That's when I knew with absolute certainty that my marriage was over. Not just because David was having an affair, but because of how easily and extensively he'd been lying to me. The man who could maintain such elaborate deceptions, who could look me in the eye every morning and evening while living a completely secret life, wasn't someone I could ever trust again. I told David I was glad he was safe and that I'd see him at home, then hung up and sat in my car in the parking garage where this whole discovery had started 3 weeks earlier. But this time, instead of feeling shocked or devastated, I felt something close to relief. The uncertainty was over. The doubt was over. The part of our relationship where I made excuses for behavior that didn't make sense was over. Now I could move forward with complete clarity about who David actually was and what our marriage had actually become. When David came home that night, I was waiting for him in the living room with 2 cups of coffee and a calmness that seemed to unnerve him. He started to launch into his usual explanation about work running late, but I stopped him with a simple question. How long have you been having an affair with Jessica? The look on his face, surprise, guilt, fear, and something that might have been relief, told me everything I needed to know. He didn't try to deny it or act confused about the accusation. He just sat down across from me and said, "How did you know?" That question, more than anything else, revealed how fundamentally our relationship had changed. He wasn't asking how I'd found out because he was sorry about hurting me or because he wanted to work things out. He was asking because he wanted to know where his performance had failed, what had given him away. We talked until dawn, and David told me everything. The affair had been going on for 4 months, starting as an emotional connection during long work sessions and evolving into something physical. He'd been planning to end it, but couldn't figure out how. He loved me, but was confused about what he wanted. He was sorry, but also admitted he wasn't sure he regretted what had happened. His honesty was more devastating than his lies had been. At least when he was lying, I could maintain some hope that he wanted to preserve our marriage. His truthfulness revealed that he'd been as conflicted about our relationship as he'd been passionate about his affair. By the time the sun came up, we'd both acknowledged that our marriage couldn't survive what had happened. Not just the affair itself, but the months of deception, the ease with which he'd maintained 2 separate lives, the fundamental trust that had been broken beyond repair. The practical details of separation were handled with the same efficiency David brought to his work projects. We divided our belongings, figured out the apartment lease, opened separate bank accounts. Within 2 weeks, he'd moved out and we'd filed for divorce. The hardest part wasn't losing David. By the time he left, I'd already grieved the man I thought he was and accepted that person had never really existed. The hardest part was coming to terms with how completely I'd been fooled, how thoroughly I'd misread the situation I was living in. But there was also something liberating about finally knowing the truth. For months, I'd been sensing that something was wrong, but couldn't identify what it was. I'd been feeling disconnected from David, but blaming it on work stress and the natural evolution of long-term relationships. I'd been accommodating behavior that made me uncomfortable because I trusted his explanations more than my own instincts. Now I knew my instincts had been right all along. The distance I'd been feeling was real. The sense that David was keeping something from me was accurate. The growing dissatisfaction I'd been attributing to other factors was actually my subconscious recognition that my husband was living a lie. The immediate aftermath of David's departure was harder than I'd anticipated. Despite knowing our marriage was over, despite being the one who'd ultimately initiated the conversation that led to our separation, I found myself grieving not just the relationship, but the entire life I'd thought we were building together. Our apartment felt cavernous without his presence. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt oppressive. I'd catch myself setting 2-place settings for dinner, reaching for his favorite snacks at the grocery store, automatically checking his schedule before making weekend plans. The habits of 7 years don't disappear overnight, even when the relationship that created them has been irrevocably damaged. Friends and family struggled to know how to respond. Some were shocked. We'd been the couple that everyone thought had it figured out, the pair that seemed stable and content and committed to each other. Others admitted they'd sensed something was off, but hadn't known how to bring it up. A few revealed they'd never really liked David, but had kept their opinions to themselves out of loyalty to me. The variety of reactions taught me something important about how we present ourselves to the world and how much of relationships people actually observe. David and I had been performing the role of a happy couple so effectively that even our closest friends hadn't realized how disconnected we'd become. Or maybe they had noticed, but hadn't wanted to interfere, assuming we'd work things out ourselves. My sister was the most direct in her response. She'd driven down from Portland the weekend after David moved out, ostensibly to help me rearrange the apartment, but really to make sure I was okay. As we moved furniture and packed away the photos that featured David prominently, she told me she'd been worried about me for months. She'd noticed that I seemed smaller somehow when I was with David, less animated, less like myself. She'd seen how quickly I deferred to his preferences, how I'd stopped talking about my own goals and dreams in favor of discussing his career plans and ambitions. She'd watched me become increasingly accommodating and decreasingly assertive, but hadn't known how to address it without seeming critical of my marriage. Her observations stung because they were accurate. I had been diminishing myself to make room for David's needs, had been so focused on being supportive that I'd forgotten to maintain my own identity and interests. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage vows. It was the inevitable result of a relationship that had become fundamentally unbalanced. I started seeing Dr. Patricia Reeves, a therapist who specialized in infidelity recovery and relationship trauma. Our sessions were initially focused on processing the immediate crisis, the shock of discovery, the pain of betrayal, the logistics of separation. But as weeks passed, we began exploring the deeper patterns that had made me vulnerable to such comprehensive deception. Dr. Reeves helped me understand that my willingness to doubt my own perceptions wasn't just about trusting David. It was about a pattern of prioritizing other people's comfort over my own intuition that went back much further than our marriage. I'd been raised to be accommodating, to avoid conflict, to give people the benefit of the doubt even when their behavior was questionable. These weren't necessarily bad qualities, but they'd become problematic when they prevented me from advocating for myself or addressing issues that needed attention. I'd become so invested in being the easy partner that I'd stopped being an equal partner. Through therapy, I also began to understand that David's affair wasn't really about Jessica specifically, or even about his dissatisfaction with our marriage. It was about his own inability to address problems directly, his tendency to seek escape rather than engagement when relationships became challenging or routine. This realization didn't excuse his behavior, but did help me stop personalizing it quite so much. The affair wasn't evidence that I was inadequate or unattractive or boring. It was evidence that David lacked the emotional tools to navigate the normal challenges of long-term commitment. The divorce proceedings were mercifully straightforward, since we didn't have children or significant assets to divide. But even the simple process of untangling our shared life felt emotionally complex. Every joint account we closed, every shared subscription we canceled, every piece of furniture we divided felt like a small death, another piece of the future we'd planned together being systematically dismantled. I kept the apartment, partly because I could afford it alone, and partly because I wasn't ready for the additional upheaval of moving. But I completely redecorated, changing the color scheme, rearranging the furniture, replacing pieces that held too many memories of our life together. I wanted the space to reflect who I was becoming rather than who we'd been as a couple. The first time I hung artwork that David would have hated, I felt a rush of freedom that surprised me. For years, I'd been unconsciously editing my choices to accommodate his preferences, choosing things we both liked rather than things I loved. Reclaiming my own aesthetic sense felt like reclaiming part of myself. I also started pursuing interests I'd abandoned during our marriage. I signed up for a photography class I'd been talking about taking for years. I started hiking again, something I'd loved in college, but had given up when David showed no interest in outdoor activities. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with, women who knew me as more than just David's wife. Each of these small steps toward independence felt significant. I was remembering who I'd been before I defined myself primarily through my relationship, rediscovering parts of my personality that had been dormant during the years when I'd been so focused on being a good partner. The loneliness was real and sometimes overwhelming, but it was a different kind of loneliness than what I'd been feeling during the final months of my marriage. Before, I'd been lonely despite having a partner, isolated even though I shared a bed with someone every night. Now I was alone by choice, which made the solitude feel more tolerable and ultimately more productive. I started keeping a journal, something I hadn't done since high school. Writing about my experiences helped me process the complex emotions I was navigating and track my progress as I rebuilt my life. Looking back at entries from the early weeks after David left, I can see how much my perspective has shifted, how much stronger and clearer I've become. The hardest nights were the ones when I'd remember good times we'd shared, moments when our connection had felt real and deep and lasting. It would have been easier if David had been consistently awful, if I could dismiss our entire relationship as a mistake. But we'd had genuine happiness together, real love and laughter and intimacy, which made his betrayal even more confusing and painful. Dr. Reeves helped me understand that it's possible for someone to genuinely love you and still make choices that destroy the relationship. David's affair didn't negate the good times we'd shared or mean that his feelings for me had never been real. It just meant that love alone wasn't enough to overcome his inability to communicate honestly when our relationship faced challenges. About 3 months after our separation, I ran into Jessica at a coffee shop near my apartment. We saw each other at the same time, and for a moment, neither of us knew how to react. She looked uncomfortable and guilty, which gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. At least she had the decency to feel bad about her role in destroying my marriage. But as I really looked at her for the first time, I felt something unexpected. Not anger or hatred, but a kind of pity. She was younger than me, probably in her late 20s, and there was something anxious and uncertain about her demeanor that suggested she might be questioning her choices. I realized that she'd gotten involved with a man who was willing to lie extensively to his wife, who was capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions for months at a time. If David could betray me so thoroughly after 7 years of marriage, what kind of partner would he be to someone he'd met through deception? I didn't approach her or try to start a conversation. There was nothing to say that would improve the situation for either of us. But seeing her helped me understand that she wasn't the villain in this story. She was just another person who'd gotten caught up in David's inability to deal honestly with his problems. The real villain, if there was one, was the pattern of avoidance and deception that had allowed our marriage to deteriorate without either of us addressing the issues directly. We'd both been complicit in creating a relationship that looked good on the surface, but lacked the depth and honesty necessary for long-term sustainability. As spring turned to summer, I started feeling ready to consider dating again. Not because I was eager to replace David or because I was lonely, but because I was curious about what it would feel like to connect with someone from this new, more authentic version of myself. The dating apps were intimidating and often discouraging, full of people who seemed to be performing versions of themselves rather than showing up honestly. But I also met some genuinely interesting men, guys who were thoughtful and direct and willing to have real conversations about what they wanted from relationships. I was much more careful this time around, much more willing to ask follow-up questions when something didn't make sense, much more committed to trusting my instincts even when they conflicted with what someone was telling me. I'd learned the difference between being understanding and being naive, between giving someone the benefit of the doubt and ignoring obvious red flags. 6 months later, I'm still processing everything that happened and everything I learned about myself in the process. I've started therapy to understand why I was so willing to doubt my own perceptions, why I was so invested in being the understanding wife that I ignored clear signs that something was seriously wrong. I've also started dating again, tentatively, and with much better boundaries than I had in my 20s. I'm learning to trust my instincts, to ask follow-up questions when something doesn't make sense, to prioritize my own emotional well-being instead of automatically accommodating someone else's needs. The woman who decided to surprise her husband with Chinese takeout was naive and trusting and willing to accept explanations that didn't quite add up. The woman I'm becoming is more careful, more aware, more willing to face difficult truths instead of hoping they'll resolve themselves. I wouldn't choose to go through the experience of discovering David's affair, but I'm grateful for what it taught me about myself and about relationships. I learned that love isn't enough if it's not accompanied by honesty and and respect. I learned that being supportive doesn't mean being passive. I learned that my instincts are trustworthy, even when I'm being told they're wrong. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is also the thing that saves you from a life that wasn't as good as you thought it was. Discovering David's affair was devastating, but it was also the beginning of becoming someone stronger, more authentic, more committed to building relationships based on truth instead of comfortable illusions. That Tuesday night in March, when I walked into the parking garage with takeout containers and hopeful expectations, seems like a lifetime ago. The woman I was then couldn't have imagined surviving what I discovered, couldn't have pictured herself rebuilding a life as a single person, couldn't have believed she'd be grateful for the painful truth that set her free. But here I am, 6 months later, stronger and wiser and more honest with myself than I've ever been. The decision to surprise David at his office changed everything forever, but not in the way I expected. Instead of strengthening our marriage, it ended it. Instead of bringing us closer together, it revealed how far apart we'd already grown. And maybe in the end, that was exactly what needed to happen.